Are you a robot?
Let's jump into it.
Where do we start? How are you doing?
Mr. Radclyffe.
How are you doing? Are you good? You've been for a run today?
I have not. I was planning on going after we recorded this.
You're going to have to go for a run after we speak.
That's generally how it's turning out these days. We talk and then I go for a run to clear my head. But we've had a good season. I'm going to give it that. I will say that it's been an incredible season, a star-studded lineup. And are there any things that popped out at you right away that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, people listening to this won't believe it, but I have like very, very, very little hand in who gets interviewed and how this thing gets put together. I just get to pop along at the end. There's a lot of magic that happens behind the scenes, and a lot of unsung heroes like Ria and Josh and Peter and Yudi. Even though you're the star,
I'm not.
Probably don't
unsung.
get as enough credit as you deserve. And so, I mean, just to give people listening a picture of kind of my perspective on the podcast is, we record these season recaps. I get to listen to the episodes as they come out. So my routine is every morning at about 7:30, I get in the car with my two sons and I drive them to their nursery kindergarten, and we get to listen to Yudi. I'm
sure they love that.
And on the way back, I get to listen without the interruptions from the two kids in the back. And that's how I listen to this podcast. I listen to it on Castbox. And so I've literally just listened to Yoav, the season 7. So, people who are listening to this season in sequence, you've had the same experience that I've had. The only difference is I've been when I get home, I kind of make some notes as to things which I think are important. Ria very kindly provides me with a briefing sheet. And then we get to have this conversation where I do my best to kind of remember what the key points are. One of the things about this season, and I've kind of, as I've been driving and listening, I've just thought, wow, this is incredible. Like, I don't know how this has come together, but so many of the episodes touch and intersect things which we think are so relevant in what we do. I guess I want to kind of spend some time exploring that. I mean, I think whether it's Jessica or Yoav or Sasha particularly, and even completely. Sharon, the conversation with Sharon and Callum. There's been so many points that have been made, and I just wanted to kind of jump in and kind of have the conversation with the guest myself and say, hey, like, that's really cool that you've been looking at this. That's what we're doing as well. And maybe it's great fun to kind of maybe talk about that a little bit.
Can I tell you a quick story before we jump into all of that? Please. So Sasha mentioned when we were in the podcast interview, she was talking about the specific use of AI to basically to solve a Rubik's Cube. I don't know if you remember when she spoke about that. And she kind of was firing some shots at that specific use because it was like, wow, it's incredible, but it is a absolutely pointless thing that we are getting AI to do, and it is spending or using up so many resources. And it has a significant impact on the environment when we are using so much computing power. And so I just kind of filed that back in my head. And yesterday for the MLOps community, we interviewed this guy, Josh. And halfway through his introduction, he was saying, and so, we at this, I think it was at OpenAI, he was working at OpenAI, and he said, and we were able to show that AI can put together a Rubik's Cube. And instantly I thought, oh my God,
That's
you're the
okay.
guy. So my second question to Josh was, well, how do you feel about the environmental effects that this Rubik's Cube thing that you created?
Yeah.
And I realized after that basically I was not making friends with Josh, asking him the second question after the introduce yourself was, so that whole Rubik's Cube that you think is a great success, actually it has a lot of environmental effects. But luckily he was a great guy. He took it in stride and he was saying, yeah, this is one of those moments where it's a great victory because it shows what machine learning is capable of. And that's really what machine learning research should be for. But it's also, we need to keep these greater points in mind that Sasha points out. Like, do we really need to be solving Rubik's Cubes? Isn't there something more important that we could be solving? And shouldn't we be conscientious of the environmental effects when we are using infinite compute and infinite data?
Yeah. There's two analogies I would offer on this. One analogy is like, everyone's experienced this in the last year. You get a knock on the door, it's the Amazon delivery, and you get this big box, and you break the seal of the box, and it's full of the plastic, bubble packaging, and you kind of rip all that open, and then inside there's another box, and you take it out, and then you've got all the kind of vacuum plastic container, and then finally there's this little thing, the thing that you ordered, and it's like you look at the packaging and you see this little thing, and that's AI. That's a perfect metaphor for AI. The thing that we're doing with AI quite often is, very, very trivial in terms of the impact that it's going to have, the improvement, the incremental improvement it's going to have. And if you look at the input costs that go into that, it's quite astounding. Not in all cases. And of course, you've got to maybe prove a model works. You've got to prove that something is possible. And then you can think about how to optimize it and how to make it more efficient. But this is definitely AI's dark and dirty secret. Mm-hmm. And the other analogy, the way I tend to think about this is it's like, imagine kind of, certainly back in my youth, I'm nearly 40. And so when I had my first car, I was 16. So it was before I was legally allowed to drive. And I used to take great pleasure in sitting in my car with the engine on the driveway, revving it, turning the steer, pretending I was driving. And, I think about that now and I think, oh my God, like I was just burning. I mean, one thing, like gas was cheaper in the late 90s, a heck of a lot cheaper than it is now. So it was not the financial cost of me doing that was different. Like now, with petrol prices as high as they are, there's no way I would dream about doing that. But that's again kind of what the AI ML industry is doing. You've got a lot of really clever people who've got toys. They've got access to, as you say, infinite compute, a significant amount of GPU acceleration that they use to do the models, and they spend a lot of time, a lot of brain power, just burning electricity for increment, hopefully, improvements, but quite often it's not an improvement. And I think we really urgently need to start to have this conversation, and not in a way of kind of shaming the ML community into being more responsible and more sustainable. And also not to let them off the hook when, some of the firms say, yeah, but our data centers are wind powered or hydro powered or solar powered. That is not, if your data centers are carbon neutral, that doesn't get you off the hook. There's still a lot of other, it's better, sure. It's a heck of a lot better than having your DC powered by a coal station, and your location strategy, where you put your data centers, where you do your compute matters. But it's not, that's the same as driving a Tesla. Doesn't pollute the air around for the people that are breathing it in, but it does have environmental impact. We can't pretend that it doesn't. And so there needs to be much more thought put into optimization and efficiency. And for me, that journey started, quite a few years ago when I was at Fidelity. I was very aware of the environmental impact of machine learning and the energy cost. I I had joined Fidelity from a startup that looked at energy efficiency and optimization of computes. And so how do we essentially do a task and make it more energy efficient? And there's lots of reasons why that's important. If you've got a mobile device with a battery, if you make your code more efficient, the battery lasts longer. I mean, that's one massive benefit. But also, we're all sitting here on Zoom calls. If a Zoom call is, if your computer is burning the same amount of energy as a strong light bulb, just keeping Zoom working, and the blurred background you've got behind you. I mean, that's machine learning is trying to work out which bit of you is you and which bit of you is the background, and this is consuming electricity. If that's badly engineered, if that code is badly written, multiplied by the millions of people that are sitting on Zoom calls every day, that's a significant impact on the environment. And yes, it might not be as great an impact as cars or planes or eating meat or other things on the environment, but these things add up. And what's happening today is very much that this question of the environmental impact of AI is seen as somebody else's problem, or it's seen as a future problem. And a lot of engineers are just not looking at this. And I think a lot of the reason they're not looking at this is because they don't get the nudge. They don't get told, when you're training a model, this is how much CO2 is being produced. And it was really great to hear what Sasha has done. And I think it's in partnership with Boston Consulting Group. They've built this carbon monitor for AI systems.
I think that's a huge thing. The carbon monitor, and her idea of hopefully in the future, we start seeing companies put on their website how much carbon was used, or how basically being more transparent about how big their environmental effect is.
Well, we can go one better than that.
What's that?
We can go one better than that. So for people who don't know EthicsGrade, we are an ESG ratings business. So we essentially, the same way that a company has, financial reports, then public companies have to report on that publicly on a quarterly basis and an annual basis. All companies, even my little tiny company, has to report on an annual basis. We thankfully now finally have recognized in the 21st century that financial performance is not the only measure of success. And our impact on the environment, our impact on society are also critical things which the world needs to know about. And so when you buy a product from one company or another company, you might be attracted by which is the cheapest product, which is the most nicely packaged product, which one looks the best, the features, lots of things. But you also might be interested in the impact in the world that company has. And increasingly that this is becoming a concern for consumers, and increasingly this is becoming a concern for investors. And we've started to see really high profile examples of organizations that have got this wrong, and they've really turned off their investor community. And the recent one, I've forgotten the name of it, it's a photo sharing app, like what's it called, Dupo or something like this. It's going to come to me. There was, the app is great, and it's done really well in the App Store, and it's, they've just raised a $20 million Series A, and there's suddenly the CEO and the senior leadership team have been embroiled in sexual harassment allegations, and all sorts of crazy stuff. And this is a governance problem. This is a really big governance issue for this organization. And what's happened is the investment has evaporated. The investors have pulled out. The app is tanking. Consumers people aren't downloading it. Sorry, Dispo is the name of the app. And we're seeing lots of examples of this in fashion, in food, in biotech is obviously going to be a key industry where reputations need to be protected, and tech obviously is the one that I'm very much having focus. And so the question is, like, what is the impact on the world of these organizations? And there's lots of questions around this, and so going into Q2, we're looking at about 160 different aspects of an organization's non-financial performance. And some of those touch environmental concerns, some of them touch social impact concerns. Some of them are governance centric. And going into Q2, we've added quite a lot more around sustainability, both in terms of products. So how circular is the life cycle of a product? Has an organization designed its product so it's not repairable or not recyclable? Do they have a business model that kind of has a planned obsolescence built into it? And also, to what extent are they giving engineers nudges when they're designing machine learning algorithms to pick more energy efficient versions of that, and also to move compute to low carbon centers. And so what we're able to do today is we're able to pick up on two things. Firstly, what's available in the public domain, and the answer is there's not enough. And that's why we also have a survey. So we contact every company that we rate. We give them an opportunity to put us right, and we ask them for information. And I think it's fair to say that those companies which have the most responsible attitude towards the world are the ones that respond, and it's great to see that. And so we strongly encourage an organization that if it is monitoring its carbon footprint of its ML systems, to tell us that, so that we can score them appropriately. And on our website, ethicsgrade.io, as we're speaking, about 40% of the companies that we've rated are publicly available. By the time this episode goes out, it will probably be nearly all of the companies we've rated. So we've rated about 200 companies, 200 of the biggest companies so far. And what you can do is you can download a scorecard. You can see the scores for each of these organizations based on the 5 categories that we look at in Q1. And in Q2, we're adding a 6th category, which is sustainability. And that's specifically looking at those 2 things: the life cycle of a product, and the optimization of the code. To what extent is the code being written in an efficient way so it doesn't burn? And so, if an organization is playing with Rubik's Cubes, don't get me wrong, it's clever. It's really clever. But, if it's doing kind of toy innovation projects like that to prove that something is possible, it should really think twice. And so, that's one of the things we rate. And our goal ultimately is to do exactly what you've just said. If we can get, via API call, we can plug directly into the MLOps platform that firm is running, then, we think that firms should be reporting on their carbon footprint of their AI systems just in the same way that they might be reporting on the carbon footprint of their factories or their offices. And this might sound, just last point here, this might sound far-fetched. This might sound like it's kind of crazy talk, but it's not long ago that when you bought a car, there was no way of easily understanding the CO2 output of that vehicle, how pollutive it was. I mean, miles per gallon was something that people cared about, because at the end of the day, that hit the user in their wallet. The person who bought the car needed to know how many miles per gallon it was how expensive was it going to be to run. But CO2 was not something that was reported on, and now it's mandatory. So many things. The energy efficiency of those things is now legally required. You buy a television or a fridge, it's legally required. And we're moving into the world now where we're going to start to see corporations being forced to report on the carbon efficiency of their offices on a per-person basis. And this is going to drive huge innovation to make sure companies are more carbon neutral. And by extension of that, we're going to start to see companies being forced to do the same around their technology estates, their cloud environments. And we're the first to market. We're the first company in the world who's looking at this and providing that data back to investors.
Well, there's an interesting ethical question there when you talk about these companies that are doing this research, and we will single out OpenAI and the Rubik's Cube fund that they had. And the idea there is that, yes, you need to continue with research. You need to show what is possible with machine learning. So how can you do that in a responsible and sustainable way?
Yeah. And that brings me to Sharon, because I think Sharon was another interview that you had where I was listening and kind of wanting to jump in. And that's probably does me good, actually, listening to this as a podcast where I'm not, this is one of the reasons, Steve, why I didn't want to be
you weren't involved.
Because I knew I would just jump in. So Sharon, I think, really intuitively has picked up on something which we've been thinking for a long time. And full disclosure, I've met Sharon, I've spoken to him, but we've not actually spoken about this exact thing. So it was really interesting to hear about his project, Citizen Intelligence, I think it's called. But basically what he's saying is that the best people in the world to decide whether AI is ethical or not are the people in the world, and we should be asking those people whether they think that this is the right thing to do or that's the right thing to do. And and he's developed a community to do exactly that, a crowdsourced community to do exactly that, and I think that's great. And essentially what we're doing, or part of what we're doing, is very, very similar, very, very aligned to this. And this comes back to some research that I did a few years ago around the techlash and why we have a techlash. And this has been a question I've pondered for years. I've had a concern about technology. I've had this kind of gut feeling that maybe the tech industry is crossing creepy lines without realizing, maybe in some cases quite intentionally doing so. But I think the techlash, this kind of the media turning against tech. I don't agree with Callum on that it's it's Murdoch and Murdoch's cronies v Zuck and co. But I think Callum is spot on though, in terms of a lot of the things that the tech industry is criticized for actually started started by the press, started by the media, and particularly Murdoch and his organizations. But leaving that aside, I think this essence of the techlash is fascinating, because just in 2011, Mark Zuckerberg was Time Person of the Year, and then 6-7 years later, he was sitting in front of Congress getting grilled, public enemy number one. What the tech industry have done, by and large, is two things, and this is why Dan Jeffries and I would disagree. I think if we were to have this conversation together, Dan basically says, you hire a bunch of really smart people to figure out the engineering and to make sure that the engineering doesn't go wrong. You build a red team and you make sure that you think about all of the unintended consequences. I agree with that. Dan is spot on. He then says you should then go hire a bunch of PR folk to spin the story and to clear up the damage when stuff does go wrong, because stuff will go wrong. And yes, that's part of it. You always want to be communicating, and I'm not saying that PR is not a useful tool, but I think the tech industry has made this big mistake where it sees actually PR as being the only tool to kind of sway public opinion. And if you look at our criticism of Microsoft, Microsoft's a fantastic company, and we score and we rate Microsoft very highly on our ratings. In fact, they're the only cloud company to get an A grade in Q1 2021, and I think that's a testament to post the dark days of Steve Ballmer, who was mad leader of Microsoft. And Microsoft has matured and become a really outstanding corporate citizen, I think, and as a great example to the rest of the tech industry and how to look at these things. But one of the things that Microsoft doesn't do, and we're critical of Microsoft before this, is that they don't really publish a lot of the detail behind how they make their ethical choices and what the governance looks like around that. What they do instead is they've got this wonderful book. You can buy it on Amazon. That's The Future Computed, and it's very glossy, and it tells about how AI is going to be wonderful for the future, and it talks about Microsoft's principles. We see a lot of that. A lot of companies are just doing this kind of marketing exercise of virtue signaling, and the equivalent of that, if we translate what we look at to climate change, the equivalent of that is like 20 years ago, sending out a bunch of execs to Africa and giving a check to a village of orphans and putting that picture, prominently on the corporate brochure. That's kind of what we're doing with AI principles today. And companies are falling over themselves. Samsung was one of the latest companies earlier this year to publish their principles of AI. I mean, there's no value in this whatsoever. I think one of the reasons that we have a tech clash is that journalists see through this, consumers see through this, and they don't really have the substance, and more importantly, they don't have the channel to be listened to. They don't have that feedback loop. Stakeholder engagement is non-existent or weak. And so I think instinctively Sherin is onto something with this. And it's one of the things that we rate companies highly on. Is I say highly on is it's turned up. The dial is turned up quite strongly on these questions. So anyone from a tech company listening to this should take note. We think best practice is where you don't just have a bunch of experts telling consumers that you've got their back and it's all good and you've engineered the heck out of the technology and it's not going to go wrong. We think best practice is where you've got a bunch of people listening and actively soliciting feedback from consumers, not a focus group, not just like a whole bunch of people in suburban Seattle, but a cross-section of society. You're actively asking them, how do they feel towards what you're doing? And you're building that feedback into what you're doing. And if you do that in a really sustained and scaled way, we don't think there would be a tech clash. We think that people would feel so bought into the process of technology and how technology is being implemented that people would come on the journey much more. And my last point on this, the excuse that the tech industry tends to use, and I remember a webinar I was on with Noah Feldman, who is a Stanford law prof, and one of the key inputs into Sheryl and Mark, their big drive around governance at Facebook. And Noah Feldman basically said the problem for Facebook is it's just too big. There's 2 point whatever billion users, and we can't go and ask every user what they think. We have to kind of make the decision for them. And he uses a kind of Boaty McBoatface example. He said, like, when this, I can't remember the full detail of the story, but basically there was like a crowdsourced campaign to name a ship. I think it was one of the UK's like flagship military vessels or research vessels, and they went out to the public and said, what should we call the ship? And some clever person thought Boaty McBoatface would be a really fun name, and it got a whole bunch of attention on social media, and then everyone voted for this, and it was the number one choice. And of course, it's such a ridiculous name. There's no way you could name the boat after that. And it's a great example of where crowdsourced ideas are just not viable. And so Noah Feldman says, we can't use crowdsourcing. We can't ask the 2 point whatever billion people that use our platform what they think, because it's just unwieldy. We'll get stupid ideas. And therefore we need to make the decision for them. And I think he's wrong. I think he's fundamentally wrong. It's not that you can't ask 2 point whatever billion people what they think. It's the fact that you have a responsibility to do exactly that. And the very fact that you've been so successful that you have 2 billion users shouldn't get you off the hook. In fact, I think it makes the necessity for you to devise a way of having a stakeholder feedback engagement process, it makes that even more important. And that's my kind of challenge to Facebook and Amazon and some of the big, really gigantic companies is, they need to look at how exactly to do this. And there are answers. There's quite a lot in the, there's Nesta in the UK. It's an innovation, kind of an arm of UK government agency that looks at innovation and science and how we innovate responsibly. They've done a lot around a technique called collective intelligence, which is essentially a kind of crowdsourcing, but crowdsourcing that aims for outcome as opposed to crowdsourcing that just creates noise. And so there are answers out there. It's just these answers haven't yet been picked up by the tech community as strongly as they should be. And that's one of the things that we rate.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you mentioned there with Callum and his ideas on the tech community and because in my eyes, he kind of let them off the hook. And we can start there and then we can go a little bit deeper into his whole thoughts about how there's going to be no jobs for us. And what I have some ideas that have rolled around in my head since that conversation I want to bring up with you. But let's start with what you thought of his ideas around Facebook being persecuted because there is one person in the world that owns all of the traditional media and doesn't like that now the new media is going to Facebook.
Yeah. So where do I start with that? I think Callum's spot on when he says that the problem originated before big tech, and the problem lies really, where organizations that provide a public service, news organizations, broadcast organizations, when they stopped being required to offer balanced arguments, that's really when things started to go wrong. And of course, the rise of talk radio in the United States created the opportunity for small interest groups to basically build feedback loops, and megaphones for those feedback loops were then built by the social media giants. And so I think the root cause of the problem is that we have to decide in terms of what is what information is broadcast by media platforms, and Facebook is a media platform as much as it denies it is. Then we have to make sure that there's a level of balance provided in any view that's being put forward. And this is a difficult problem. There's a lot of people working on this. There's not any easy answers. But it doesn't, because it's a difficult problem, doesn't get people off the hook. And when it comes this question, I think that keeps reoccurring in this podcast is, should we intervene or will it slow down innovation? We're 20 years on from the newspaper industry being disrupted by the web. We're 20 years on and there's no regulation on this. And so this is not a question about, or maybe we should just not intervene. I mean, what the fuck is going on here? This is a non-argument. Anyone who says that, regulatory intervention might slow down innovation, I mean, they just need to look at they need to kind of read some history back to oh man, what was his name? To such a good guest. Who was the guy that we had on, the historian who was looking at Y2K?
Zachary.
Yeah. Oh my God, that was one of my favorite episodes, and I forgot his name. Sorry, Zachary. But he made a great point. That you just have to read a bit of history to kind of see where this has gone wrong in the past, and there's probably the answer. So I think there's the root cause. It's about balance on platforms, and then I think the second problem is that some of the big platforms like Facebook and others have really gone out of the way to try and to say we just make paper. If you use the analogy that we're like a news, we're not a newspaper. We're not. We're just the paper manufacturer. Other people write the news that's printed on our paper, and you wouldn't hold the paper manufacturer to account for a slanderous article in a newspaper. No, that's the editorial staff and the people who wrote the article, and that's the infrastructure that's built on our platform. We just make paper. I mean, that's such BS. It's absolute BS. I mean, it's a good metaphor in a way, but what it denies is there's a category difference between a newspaper and Facebook. Facebook has 2.whatever billion users. There's never been a newspaper that's had such immense reach. And there's never been a newspaper empire, as much as people like Murdoch have tried, that caters for, both sides of the arguments. There's never been a universal news organization. And so Facebook and these other platforms have a totally different level of responsibility, even to newspapers. They have a much greater responsibility in some ways. And if that slows down innovation, then that is a very, very, very small price to pay. So I think Callum and I are on the same page around that. I don't agree with all of what Callum says. And Callum is somebody I've got to know over the last 5 years, and I held him in great regard. consider him a friend. We're involved in a foundation together, which is raising awareness for the potential negative impacts of joblessness that might come from automation, and that's something which he and I care deeply about. One of the really interesting things about that debate is a little bit like maybe the Green lobby, or maybe the kind of the Brexit, the kind of anti-Brexit lobby, is that while we're united on the issue, we're quite divided in terms of the cause of the issue and maybe the solutions for the issue. And I think it makes it a really difficult problem to channel, to marshal. Is Callum is faced with the foundation that we run, and the people in orbits around that foundation. They come from the left and the right of the political spectrum. They have very different worldviews, and therefore it's very, very hard to kind of point to solutions that are workable. And so Callum and I, we have a lot of common ground in terms of we strongly believe and are worried about some of the impacts of automation. We disagree about the timescale. We disagree about how it's going to happen. We disagree about the solutions. And I think that makes it really interesting. But it's also the challenge, because I think the other side of that debate, that AI is not going to remove jobs, it's going to create jobs. That other side of the debate is much more united around that viewpoint and the vision that it sells. And I think that makes it a much more dangerous adversary, because they're united, but they are wrong. And that's our challenge.
Well, I am a little bit skeptical about this whole thing. I do understand that Callum mentioned, he said it's not that he can tell when it's going to happen. He just says that it will happen. And for me, I look at the kind of stuff that I see right now, machine learning doing, and doing horribly. And I also look at the problems that we're faced with that I feel like machine learning has created and AI has created. And I think to myself, we can't even get this right. How are we expecting to get something like this grandiose idea of AI is going to take over everything and we aren't going to have any jobs anymore, when really the small piece that AI is doing right now, it's failing at quite miserably in a lot of use cases. So I look at that and I think, I can see the argument that yes, it will happen, but I am very skeptical if it's going to be in my lifetime even.
So here's the thing. I mean, I did a TED talk on this question: will robots take our jobs?
You love to keep reminding us about that TED talk you did, don't you?
I do, because it's going to do a much better job in 18 minutes of telling the story than I'm going to do now. I think the secret is, I mean, I don't believe it's going to happen in our lifetime. And I've said this to Callum, and him and I disagree about this fact. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime. That's my best guess, is it's not going to happen in our lifetime. But equally, I'm very open-minded that I might be wrong. And I'm very open-minded because there's a lot of people out there in Silicon Valley and China and other places working their guts out to make it happen faster than that. There's a whole industry of people who are working on automating all different aspects of our lives. And so if they are right and I am wrong, then it's going to happen sooner. And it's not just the people that are working on this, it's the amount of capital that's flowing into this. I mean, this is like, I love history of technology. This is like the 1840s, when just an incredible amount of capital, aristocratic capital, merchant wealth, flowed into building railways. It was just this incredible bubble. And we're left with the consequences of that bubble today. There was no planning. There was no coordination. I mean, why is it that a small little town like Windsor on the outskirts of London has 2 train stations that are like kind of next door to each other, but not joined up? I mean, it's like nuts. You go into London, it's just a complete mess. And the reason that London is such a mess is because it was a total free-for-all. And, train lines are kind of hardwired into the landscape, and cities are built around them. And London will always be this mess because there was no proper planning, there was no proper controls around this. And so I think there's a lesson here. There's a huge amount of capital flowing into automation, and the impact it's going to have is going to be there for a long time. So I guess point one is there's a lot of people betting against me here, and they're the very people that are saying, "Oh, but don't worry, because we'll find new work. We'll invent this kind of magic work category." So let's take that part of the argument. And so I accept that they are right on the long-term view, on the macro lens view. If you take any issue over a long enough time frame, it becomes a non-issue. You could say, well, that meteor that hit that wiped out the dinosaurs. I mean, that was a pretty shitty day. If we talk about climate change, I mean, that's pretty much up there in terms of cataclysmic climate change. But like on the long-term view, probably did us a favor. We probably wouldn't exist. New York would probably be a very different city if it had to have a gigantic anti-dinosaur fence built around it. So if you take a long enough view on things are not an issue. And I'm of the view that, yes, we might destroy our planet in the same way that we create a runaway greenhouse effect and we become like Venus and the air is like, crazy and there's no form of life that can survive. But it's much more likely that we're going to, wreck parts of the environment, but the planet is perfectly inhabitable for other creatures or some species, and we will probably be smart enough to figure our way out of surviving. It just won't be as nice as the paradise we live in today, or the paradise our ancestors lived in. So I think, again, if you take a long enough view on things are probably not as bad as they seem. And the problem here, again, coming back to history, in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was kicking in and displacing huge amounts of work, if you take a long-term view on that, isn't it amazing? The Industrial Revolution has created this wonderful, beautiful world that we live in today, the world of opportunity for most people in the Western world. We live fabulously wealthy and rich lives compared to our ancestors. Unimaginable abundance compared to our ancestors. But if we go back 5, 6, 7 generations, our same ancestors were living in abject poverty. London was a total shithole for half the population. Where Karl Marx was writing in Kentish Town in the 1840s, he couldn't imagine how to lift this number of people out of poverty. He could only see evil and wrong in what he saw around him. So again, it's about perspectives on timescales. And my worry about automation is that it might work out. They might be absolutely right. We might invent these new categories of jobs, and our descendants, 7, 8, 10 generations from now, may have this utopian world. And I hope that they do, and I hope they listen back to this podcast and think, well, what on earth were these guys worrying about? But my concern isn't for them. My concern is for my kids and my grandkids and their friends and their peers and their contemporaries, because I think the world is going to be a pretty shitty place for a lot of people who lose their jobs through automation and aren't able to reskill in their lifetime. And that's the concern I have. The second point there, are we going to automate all jobs? I'm with Callum on this. Yes, in the long term. But when I say long term, I mean like in a time frame that I can't comprehend. But I don't think that's really what the issue is about. I think the issue is about it's a much smaller section of society than that. I worry about a few thousand highly motivated, highly disenfranchised people. And I worry about that dream of a full employment economy being broken, and a few thousand people realizing that in their lifetimes they won't be able to reskill and retrain and find new sources of employment, and therefore become dependent on handouts. And that's what concerns me. And it's that scale of the problem, and incrementally bigger than that I think becomes an issue for societal unrest. I mean, we saw what happened on the Capitol in January. We saw what a few thousands or tens of thousands of people can do what havoc they can cause, we seem to still believe that we're immune to social unrest in the West, and we're really not. And that's my biggest worry. And will it come from truck drivers, or will it come from taxi drivers, or will it come from something I haven't thought about? Probably something I haven't thought about. School teachers. So that's the issue, I think. And then the last point, there's two more points. One more point and one solution. Will we create this magic category of new jobs? And the answer is always, well, we did it in the past, we'll do it again in the future. Yes, we can't, and it's impossible to predict what kind of new forms of, virtual reality jobs I think Callum talks about. I think Callum's right. We won't be able to predict the new jobs, but I think there's a really, really, really important distinction about what we're doing now with AI and the technologies of the past. And that distinction is why the outcomes in the future are going to be different. And this is, I think, the most important point. In the past, we were building technology with superhuman capability. If you think about all of the breakthroughs of the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, most of those things were about tools that had leverage. Like, you think of a hammer. A hammer can knock a nail into a wall in a way that you can't push it into a wall. It's giving you leverage. It's amplifying your ability. It's superhuman capability. The airplane, the internet, Google, every technology you can think of in the 20th century, you can categorize it into superhuman capability. And so what we've learned is that if you give people superhuman technology, then we create new jobs. We create new possibilities for people. Over a long enough time frame. The difference between that, everything in the past, and what we're doing in this community with machine learning, with robotics, and with automation software, RPA, orchestration tools, APIs, and I lump those together deliberately to provoke a bit of a debate. But that's probably for another conversation, the link between APIs and RPA. What all of those things are doing, they are human abilities. If you think about robotics, like the Shadow Robotics in London, the company that makes the robotics hand that Jeff Bezos was playing with at one of the trade shows, it is literally human dexterity that is being replicated in a machine. And so if you've done enough of those things, if you have replicated all of humans' physical ability in a machine, then what is left for a human to do with its body in terms of economic opportunity? I mean, logically, there is nothing left. And so, one of the great examples is the Robo Cup. It's a soccer team of robots. And I mean, if you look back like 7 or 8 years ago, it's so funny because these little machines are like utterly incapable. I mean, some of them kick each other because they get confused where the ball is. It's like, I mean, watching a bunch of children, watching a bunch of 3-year-olds play football is they have better skills. But already, if you watch Boston Dynamics, what's possible, the cutting edge of robotics is already pretty amazing. And the teams of people behind the Robo Cup have the goal that by 2050, a team of robotic soccer players will be able to beat the World Cup winning human team of soccer players at a game of football. And that's totally doable. 29 years away, I will put money on that being a victory for the robots. And so this is the problem. It's human abilities that are being replicated in machines. And so what is left apart from a very, very small slice of jobs, and this is what I talk about in my TED Talk, is about things which require human touch. And I think that's the debate we need to have. And, coming back to EthicsGrade, and this is the solution, what we're saying to organizations like Spotify, you had Sydney on this podcast talking about, don't worry, it's all gonna be fine, we're just making jobs better. The challenge we give to companies that are automating, and don't get me wrong, automation is a great thing. It has a huge economic benefits, and we encourage people to do this. And I'm with Callum on this. We should proactively automate as fast as possible. It's a great thing to do. But at the same time, organizations who are involved in automation ought to be saying, it's our responsibility to the people that we have to make sure that their skills grow as we are automating. And as we make redundancies, as we let people go, we need to make sure that they are given lifelong skills. And we need to be working with our competitors in our industry to make sure that we as an industry are looking after the people in our industry and that they have an opportunity to transition into other work. And yes, that's going to slow down a little bit of innovation. Yes, that's going to slow down a bit of automation, but it's a heck of a lot better outcome doing that than doing what happened in, I live on the border with Wales, just 30 miles to my west. Coal mines were shut down with very little regard for the communities of people who live there. And, 30 years on, heck, it was 40 years ago, those communities are still living with the impact of that. And that's my concern with automation. And there's a way out of this. And the way out of it is just for firms like Spotify, like my former employers who have big automation programs to put a little bit of money aside to explore the risks that automation might have social impact in a shorter time frame, and to use some of those funds to explore how we should solve for those risks. And although I'm not a fan of UBI, that's one of the options. There's many other options I'm sure we haven't thought about, but I think the people who ought to look at that are the people who are doing automation.
You're saying that it needs to be the responsibility of the actual companies that are going to be cutting out these different jobs, and they need effectively to create an R&D department that looks at how they can transfer or successfully move these people on.
Yeah, not an R&D department. I don't think it's their responsibility to fix the problem, but I think what they should be doing is looking at it at an industry level and saying, in the same way, again, climate change is a great model for so many things here. The oil and gas industry finally have committed some of their profits into looking at how the impacts of climate change can be mitigated, and some of that has gone into kind of R&D initiatives, and that's done. Yes, BP and Shell, and they will have their own departments looking at clean energy and carbon extraction and other things, but at the same time they're investing at an industry level in think tanks and academic research and things which are in the collective good. And really coming back to the ESG, that's what ESG is about. It's about understanding your stakeholders. The old sort of Milton Friedman days of your stakeholders as a capitalist, as a CEO of a corporation, were your your shareholders. Your only duty for social impact was to make sure that you create shareholder value. That was the world of the 1970s, and this is the world of the 2020s. Now, our set of stakeholders is much greater, and they include employees, and they include non-employees, and I think that's what I'm saying here is that if you're, let's take an example of a role. Let's take a accounts payables clerk. He or she will be sitting there receiving paper invoices, typing in the details into an ERP platform, and then marking them for approval for somebody else to then push the pay button. And, if in a big enough company, there'll be tens of people doing that all day long. And okay, we can offshore it to India because the labor's cheaper there. We can scan the invoices when they come in and send them out to people in India to type them in from one screen to another screen. And, that is exactly what happens today. And we can then decide to outsource it. We can say, well, actually, we don't need to employ those. We don't need to be specialists in how to manage those 10 people sitting out in India or in Mexico or Poland or wherever. We can hire a company to do that for us as an outsourced service. And they have like 10,000 people in India, and they just become the world's best accounts payables data entry company in the world. I mean, that's kind of the world we've lived in over the last couple of years. But already accounts payables data entry clerks don't have a future because all of that can be automated quite easily. And to Yoav's point, there are a category of work that should be automated, and that is a category of work that absolutely should be automated. There's nothing about that. It doesn't make my invoice better that it was entered by a human, or it was a human paid the invoice. It doesn't make you feel better when you receive the money in your bank at the end of the month. All you care about is it was done efficiently without any mistakes.
Great point.
So that's definitely a category you want to automate. The question is, if all the accounts payables clerks in the world are replaced by, Salesforce's accounts payables module, which they launched today, within 12 months, there won't be a single one of those jobs left in existence. Now, thankfully, those types of workers can easily retrain into any other form of data entry clerk work. But as you can probably see, if you've solved that problem, you've kind of solved all of the data entry clerk problems. So then what are those people then going to do? And that's what I'm really saying is, I'm not saying that we should have a union of data entry clerk workers, but it's kind of like that. If you're a firm and you're putting automation in place, and the consequence of that is going to be it changes the nature of people's work. There's two things you should do. One, make sure that they have a path to other forms of economic skills, and that's a retraining imperative. That is a responsibility you owe to your own people, we believe. And then secondly, you should be talking with your peer group, your competitors, your industry, and say, hey, this particular aspect of all of our collective environments is going to be something which we can see is going to be automated out of existence in the next 5 to 10 years. Collectively, as an industry, that means that 2,500 people that were formerly employed by our industry are not going to be employed by our industry anymore. And yes, they might go and do exactly the same work in another industry, but the likelihood is that other industry is also going to automate it. So how do we as an industry make sure that those 2,500 people have an economic future? And that's an industry problem. And there's, lots of stakeholders that should be involved in that. Probably, political parties will probably have a view in that. Unions will probably have a view in that. But there's other stakeholders, and not least of which the people themselves. And I think the danger right now, in terms of where the needle is set, and all these things are balanced. The needle right now is that firms like Spotify, I don't want to single out Sydney here, but
picking on them a little.
She did kind of say this on this podcast, so it's kind of fair game. But some firms are saying, don't worry, we're just making the nature of work better, and we're improving, employee satisfaction. And if we do make people redundant, there'll be this new work for them to come into. That's a very, very, very naive perspective, and I think all of us need to be a little bit more responsible towards that.
So let's talk, before we finish up, about Yoav's ideas. And as you mentioned, he said there are some things that should be automated and there are some things that shouldn't. And as you were talking about the robot football team, that is a perfect example in my mind of something that should not be taken over by robots, because the whole drama of a football game is that you see people get tired and then they can't shoot as well and they get injured, or there's this back and forth and you have someone that flails and falls over on purpose or because they actually got pushed. And so that's the stage, that's the show. And that's what I love about it. And I think a lot of people love about football. All of a sudden you take out that human element and it's just robots playing at each other, which don't get tired and they don't have worse shots after 90 minutes than the first 5 minutes. And it's a different game. And so I don't think, in my mind, I would ever want to watch robots after the novelty wears off. I wouldn't want to watch robots playing each other. And that's just kind of a microcosm in this macrocosm of there are some things that aren't going to go away. And I think you have put it really well on things that require humanity, like things that require a human touch aren't going to go away.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's definitely going to be people who will say, well, actually, I might watch a robot football match. And maybe there's a greater bunch of people who do that in the same way that I never thought that people would sit and watch other people play video games on YouTube, and that's become a thing. And doesn't seem like that's going to go away. And I'm probably of a generation that won't understand that. So maybe there is a market for robot football teams playing each other. I mean, there's obviously a lot of as a market for kind of sort of robo wars of like, people building robots to kind of destroy other robots in like a robo wrestling type environments. And so who knows? I mean, I always kind of try and keep an open mind with this stuff. Yes, there's going to be forms of entertainment that we can't imagine, and over a long enough period of time, I think maybe a lot of these things will fall away. I think there is a novelty value in watching a human team play a robots team because there's no harm done if humans lose. It's another kind of tick in the box. And I think really what the robotic industry and AI industry is doing is it's just one small step at a time. We did chess in the 90s. We've done Go now. Other forms of sport and entertainment are going to be picked off. But let's pick some stuff that we would definitely not do. Would you put a robotic boxer in the ring against the world champion?
Great point.
That should be obvious.
Yeah.
I've just watched the Rocky series. I for my great shame, I've never seen a Rocky movie until about 3 weeks ago, it's brilliant on so many levels. And what's great about it is it's the same frigging plot, like 8 times. Even the Creed movies are like the same plot. But it has the right mix of gut-wrenching emotion and a bit of violence, and it works. And so Sylvester Stallone has done a really good job there of building that formula. But I think one thing is clear. I mean, I never really appreciated how brutal boxing could be. I've never seen a boxing match in real life. I've never watched one on television, and now I've watched 8 movies about boxing. But that's so really clear to me. You would not put a robot in the ring against a human. Why? Because the robot would just do so much damage, the first blow. But 2 robots boxing together, yeah, I could perhaps see that might, to some people, be of entertainment value. But I think to your point about sport and to Callum's point about art, it is the human element in some of these cases that does make it so compelling. And so I think there's sort of 2 things. There's the engineering challenge of can we do this thing? And I know there's people like trying to build robotic sports cars to race around a racing track. And one day they may even be faster than Formula One drivers. And I can believe that day will come. Will that replace sport? No, probably not, is my view. I think sport will remain to be a category of work for people, and probably extraordinarily highly paid work for people. That's certainly the trend we've seen over the last century. But will that make us all sports people? I don't think so. And at the same token, technology might enable more of us to be artistic, but will that make us all artists? I don't think so. And I think the problem, and this is more an economics point than a technology ethics point, the problem is really our economic system, capitalism, as we call it. I mean, ultimately it comes down to, there's a group of people that own resources, capital, and those resources are extracted and transformed via labor into goods which are consumed. People get paid, people consume more, money goes back to the capitalists. I mean, that's the capitalist system. I do think this breaks down. I do think this paradigm breaks down if we reach a tipping point of automation, and that paradigm breaks down because there's too much wealth will accrue to capital owners, and not enough wealth will accrue to the rest of us. And I think that's really the problem where it comes to work and art and sports. Is how do the rest of us find avenues to create wealth? How do we create capital wealth, not income necessarily, but capital wealth? And therefore, how do we have a society where people have social mobility? And I think to me that's the deal that you and I have grown up with. We've grown up in different countries. We've grown up with different economic realities, but we've also grown up largely with similar opportunities and similar opportunities to people like Zuck. I don't at all begrudge him his wealth because he's worked hard, he's got lucky, and he had the kind of similar opportunities to the rest of us, and it could have been us. And I think the lottery of economic life, that is it's not a fair system, and obviously there's a lot of people in the world who don't have the opportunities that you and I had, we're definitely in the overprivileged bucket. But I think for all of us, the reason we can maybe accept inequality of wealth and inequality of outcomes is because we have similar opportunities. And I think that's the thing we've got to really optimize for as we automate our economy, is to make sure that opportunity accrues equally across society. And maybe that way we avoid the social unrest.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because not in all countries do we have this guaranteed or the known, or just it's not a given that social mobility is a thing. Like when you I look at India and the caste systems, and that is something that it's not guaranteed that you have social mobility. And so I wonder about that. And I think that's a huge point that you make, is that's what we want. We want to continue with that. How can we make that a reality as we move forward? And go ahead on that.
I think on that, I mean, I've tried to be a student of it's clear that China's going to play a massive role in our future, whether we like it or not. And I've tried to be a student of as much of Chinese, history and culture as I can be over the last few years. So, at least I personally can be better prepared for that future and understand it more. And I think one of the most interesting things about Chinese culture and Chinese history is actually, I think they've done, perhaps in many ways, a better job of exactly that than we have in the West. And it's not universally true. I mean, I think you can't have a conversation about equality in China without mentioning Xinjiang and the persecution of their Muslim population and the human rights allegations that are perpetrated there. So it's not a perfect system, but I think for the Han people, for the kind of the majority in China, they have had a kind of a sort of technocratic meritocracy for longer than we have in the West. And by which I mean, the path in old days in China, the path to power and success was through essentially studying, elements of governance, and basically to be a civil servant was the kind of highest status in Chinese society. And it took a lot of hard work and study and intellect and ability, natural luck, to kind of get there. But that's deeply ingrained in their culture. And I think, China today is very much that land, is the American dream, as we once called it. What doesn't exist in China is the ability for me to land in the port of Shenzhen or Nanjing and suddenly make it as a successful business person. That immigrant's dream that was America, and is no longer true of America either. Largely is not something that China enjoys. But one thing it is true is that you can come from the paddy fields and to the city, and with a high hope and a high likelihood of outcome that your kids will have a much, much, much better life than you had and your ancestors had. And I think in the West, that's the problem we're going to have in a century, is going to be China is going to enjoy that privilege that we had in the 20th century. Our kids hopefully have a better life than we had, but it's not certain that that's going to be the case. And in China, that is very, very certain. For most people, their kids will have a better life. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to wrestle with. And technology is going to play a big role. And just one last point on this point. I hope we don't have to talk about robots and jobs again for a few episodes, for a few seasons. But Callum made a prediction. You said, where's it going to happen first? Is it going to happen in America first, or Europe first, or where? Or is it going to be the emerging world, the global south, that are going to struggle with this more? Or are they going to get it later? And Callum said it will happen in America first, and then Europe, and then India, and then China. Totally disagree with him on that. It's going to happen in China first. And it's probably going to impact somewhere like India more in a negative way. And as for us in Europe and America, we might actually be somewhat immune to automation for the first wave or two. It might not actually impact us too much at all, but I think places like India will impact significantly. And there's a lot of evidence for this. China is investing massively in robotics, absolutely massively across all slices of society, not least of which in agriculture. And I think agricultural robotics is going to become a massive industry. And China is just in a totally different category to the United States or any other country I've seen in terms of its innovation in that regard. And what does that mean? It means that, no farmers. They probably have a smaller emotional attachment to agriculture and farming than we do. If I live next to a farm, if my neighbor got put out of work from robots, I think he would be pretty upset. He would probably stab the machine with a pitchfork. And so it's hard to advocate in the UK that farming should be automated. In China, not a problem at all. And I think we're going to see, China provide food for their people, free or cheap or close to free, much, much faster than anywhere else in the world. And one of the things that's driving this is China's actually struggling with a food shortage. And so China has done a lot of campaigning, the political party of China has done a lot of campaigning recently about people. It was quite fashionable as people kind of came into new wealth over the last decade or two, and having a level of decadence has been almost fashionable. It's been quite common for people to have parties and to invite guests and have banquets, and to kind of, one way of demonstrating your wealth is to order more food than anyone could possibly reasonably eat. And of course, all of that food is wasted and thrown away. And what China's realized very quickly is that that's not sustainable, and they can't produce enough food to feed their population. And so what they're really clamping down on is wastage of food. And there's a whole campaign around food wastage. Only basically buy what you can eat, and don't let other people kind of waste food in this way. And it's really, and because of quite a autocratic system, people are conforming to that much, much faster than we would conform. If that happened here, people would just have food parties and throw away food in spite of what the government is saying. I mean, we have that mentality. They're conform. And at the same time as that, trying to reduce the amount of food that people are consuming, they're also looking to automate food production as fast as they possibly can, so they can really optimize their yield. And what's going to happen? Those two things, they're going to come together. Food will be automated. There'll be no farmers in China. The whole population will have free, abundant food, and the rest of us will be wondering, where the heck did that come from? And I think we need to talk about that more, not in this podcast, but in general society, because I think the utopian and the dystopian outcomes, and I mean them both together in parallel at the same time, the utopian outcomes and the dystopian outcomes that will come from technology will happen in China before they happen here. And our role in the UK, in Germany, in the United States, and other places is to look at China and to try to pick perhaps the menu of what outcomes we want.
Fascinating stuff. Last thing before we go, I guess next time we chat, we will be able to talk more expertly or just more clearly around Yoav's thought of vaccine passports. That's something that hopefully in 2 months we will know better.
You didn't just say that like just to trigger me, did you?
Just save it for the next time. That's all I got to say. I'm wondering.
Man, you can't do that. You can't do that. Okay,
we've gone way too far over. I got my daughter here yelling at me. We're going for a walk.
All right.
So next time we'll know what's going on and where we're going with this vaccine passport thing. And that's about it. I am going to sign off.
Cliffhanger.
Yeah, exactly. Tune in for the next time.
You know exactly like how to dangle this little kind of, I know I can wind him up by getting him to talk for 5 minutes on this thing. I'm gonna tell him he's not going to have a chance to, and I'm going to be sitting here for months now stewing on this. So.
Yeah, I'm sure your argument and your discourse is going to be fully formed and ready for a talk next time we get together. And
bye, buddy.
So I appreciate this, Charles, as always. Let's do it again soon.
Let's do it again soon. Thanks. Have a good walk. Speak
See
soon.
ya.